Now, the second thing that we get to here is yielding to authority in the church. Okay? Now, I'm going to tell you right now, each of these categories just get more and more interesting and exciting. And so, but if you look at verse 11 here, we started off with the easy one, modesty, and now we're going to go to yielding to authority. But if you look at verse 11 right here, he says this, "Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet." Wow! All right. I'm glad we have so many visitors here this morning. Seems like when we hit these topics, everybody shows up. But I want to explain this to you in a way that our church believes, but also to what I think of Scripture is saying. And if you look at verse 7, he says that women should learn quietly. I'm just going to tell you right now, this is one of the worst translations of a word in all of Scripture. Because the word really isn't quiet, it's peaceable. The word here is really, and he uses it in another part of this book as well. And it says it should mean peaceable, or the idea is to learn without contention. It's not total silence. It's not to you know that you are silenced or shut up when you come into a church. And so many people have abused this verse and demanded that women be silent in the church. And that's not what this means. It means to be peaceable. Now, why is Paul saying that? Little cultural context here as well. Back in Paul's time, when they went to church, they would divide the church up. The men would sit on one side, and the women would sit on another. Now, here's the thing. The only one who were educated were the men. Women weren't educated back then. And most men were barely educated. And when you brought people who were of the Gentile background, they didn't have a background in church. And so oftentimes what would happen is as the pastor is preaching, a woman who was on one side of the church, she could be in the very far back, and her husband could be sitting in the front, and she would literally say, "Honey, what does that mean?" Like she would interrupt the whole service. And there was often times, and you go to other cultures, if you go to India, they still do this today. They separate the sexes, and oftentimes there's a lot of squawking going back and forth, and they can handle it in that culture. But Paul says, when he's saying peaceable, he's saying without contention. So part of the contention is without interruption in the midst of the service, but also too that they come to their husband or they go to their pastor and they ask in person, and that they learn peaceably. And to learn in silence has the idea of women receiving the teaching of the men God has chosen to lead the church with submission rather than contention. And so there's another part too. The fact is that when a church is biblical and they have men in leadership and men are teaching from the pulpit and the authority teaching, that when women come in, there's also a submission to that leadership. Now, everybody has a different definition of submission. But really what the word means here is to sit under willingly. Okay? That doesn't mean that you receive everything, lock, stock, and barrel, and you just agree with it. That's not what it's saying here. In fact, the Bible tells us that we need to be Bereans. If I teach something that you either don't understand or maybe not agree with, you have the freedom in our church to come up and ask me in a peaceable manner. Now, depending on how well this message ends, I might have a long line or I might have a short line. But the issue here is to sit under willingly, wanting to learn. Okay? In our English language, it just comes off as so harsh and so black and white, but really what it is it's Paul setting up women so that they can learn in the best atmosphere. And so what we see here in this first part is that they learn peaceably. Now let's keep going on, verse 12. And in verse 12, he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Now, let me stop right here because now he's going on to teaching authority. And Paul's meaning is very clear here. Women are not to have the role of teaching authority in the church. Now, my wife and I, we had a great conversation about this week because there's just a lot of black and white, but there's also a lot of gray areas. You know, because what if a woman is highly capable of teaching? I think my wife is a more capable teacher than I am. She's an amazing teacher. God has gifted her. And listen, she taught, the ladies who are here on Thursday morning, they got it. She taught on sex and all that kind of stuff, and it was crazy in here, but she was bringing the word. And so she's an awesome teacher. So what is she capable of doing? Well, the way that God has set up the order in the church is that there's plenty of areas that she can teach. She can teach the women. She can teach the children. But when it comes to teaching with authority, which means teaching from the Bible in front of the whole church, that role is reserved for men, even though she's a fully capable teacher. Why? And this is the problem that people have with this. It's because this is the order that God has set up. It's the principle that He's set up. And David Guzik says something great. He says, to be under authority is the principle, and not teaching men is the application. And really, the cultural challenge must be seen in its true context, because it's not just a struggle between men and women, it's a struggle with the issue of authority in general. Since the 1960s, there's been a massive change in the way that we see and accept authority. We see it today. Citizens do not have the same respect for government's authority. Students don't have the same respect for a teacher's authority. Women don't have the same respect for men's authority. Children do not have the same respect for parental authority. Employees don't have the same respect for their employer's authority. And it can go on. But it's matriculated into the church where now people of a church have a hard time with the church's authority. They don't have a respect for it. They challenge it. They think it's their right and their role to do that. And what Paul is trying to simply say is that the authority in the church has been given to men. Yes, he's gifted women with the ability to teach. He's even given women the ability to have authority. And this is where I want to make a clear delineation, because this is where people get all crazy. There's only two places in the world that God has placed men as authority over women. The first is in the church, and the second is in the marriage. Those are the only two places that He dictates in Scripture. Everywhere else, women can have authority. They can teach. They can lead. They can hold political offices. They can teach in colleges. They can lead colleges. They can own their own businesses, all that kind of stuff. And sadly, a lot of people in the church have taken this verse to believe that women should not have any authority. And that's not what it's saying whatsoever. But in God's order, He said, He is set apart. In the church and in the home, the man is supposed to lead. Now, sadly, in both institutions, men have refused to do that. They've refused to exercise their authority, and so women have had to step up in the home, and oftentimes have had to step up in the church as well. But what I want you guys to understand here is that this is the way God has set it up. And the thread goes all the way from the Old Testament all the way through the New Testament. It does not change. But our culture has rejected the idea of a difference in roles between men and women. And now they reject any idea of any difference between men and women. And the driving trends in our culture point towards men who are more like women and women who are more like men. And the Bible is just as specific that there's no general submission of women unto men commanded in society, only in the spheres of the church and the home. And men don't have exclusive authority. The only authority that I have as your pastor is the authority that you give me. Because it's not me ordering, it's actually you coming and submitting underneath the church's authority. And other men have no authority over you. Nobody. Except for your husband.